Well, hello there, everyone. We want to welcome you to WHYY's Virtual Commons. I'm Tracy Matisak, and today we are talking about how to talk to children about race. Of course, the murder of George Floyd at the hands of Minneapolis police sparked protests all across the nation and indeed around the world against racism and police brutality. And then, of course, his name, along with Breonna Taylor and Ahmaud Arbery and so many others, have become names that we are all familiar with for tragic reasons. And of course, their deaths now have sparked a long overdue conversation about race and racism in America. Of course, talking about race is often uncomfortable, and it can become especially fraught when children are added into the mix. In fact, that was the subject of a recent story by WHYY reporter Sabrina Ems, and her story became the inspiration for the conversation that we're about to have today. So that said, let me introduce our panelists. We've got two with us, and we may be hearing from a third shortly. In the meantime, let me welcome Dr. Wanjiku Chirage. She is a psychiatrist and the program director of the Department of Child and Adolescent Psychiatry and Behavioral Sciences at Children's Hospital of Philadelphia. Her areas of expertise are early child development, media research, cultural research, and ethnically diverse children. Dr. Barbara Thellamore is assistant professor of psychology at Swarthmore College. Her research interests include how interpersonal relationships with parents and peers influence various outcomes in Black immigrant adolescents and emerging adults, including identity development and academic achievement and engagement. And then finally, Dr. Jason Lewis, welcome. Dr. Lewis is a psychologist and associate director of the outpatient program in the Department of Child and Adolescent Psychiatry and Behavioral Sciences at Children's Hospital of Philadelphia. His areas of expertise are evaluation and treatment of mood disorders and disruptive behavior disorders, group interventions, including parent training groups, and depression groups. So thank you all so much for being with us today and sharing your expertise with us. Thank you. So our panelists will be taking your questions in just a little while. So we would invite you to please feel free to click on the Q&A icon. You'll see it kind of to the right of your screen there, and you can feel free to submit your questions there, and we will get through as many as we can before time is up. So Dr. Jason Lewis, let me begin with you. You have said that these kinds of conversations about race with children are not to be taken lightly, that parents really need to do some thinking and some planning about how to approach them. What would you suggest for parents who maybe haven't had this conversation yet and are feeling a little bit uncertain about where to start?
Yeah, great question. Can everyone hear me?
Yes.
Okay. Yeah, great question. So I think the first step is just, or the first point is just having the conversation is really important. So I think as parents, we always want to make sure that we have all the details and all the right things to say before we engage in such a conversation. And I think we need to know that we're not always going to have the right things to say, have all the information, but that shouldn't stop us from having these conversations. So the first thing that I always say to parents is, recognize that there's going to be some limitations, but it's really important to sort of open the dialogue. And depending on the age of the child, you may elicit a little bit from the person, whether, if it's an adolescent versus a younger child, sort of eliciting sort of their awareness, their experience. I think as parents, we often assume that our kids aren't as aware as much as they are. The truth is our kids know a lot. They hear things, whether it's through the media or talking with friends or hearing from other adults. So our kids are far more aware of these topics than we give them credit for. And so just opening up the dialogue, having a question, sort of what has been your experience? What is your understanding of what's going on? And you can use that as a jumping off point to see kind of where they're at and to meet them in the right spot.
Dr. Lewis, you mentioned age, and Dr. Chirage, I want to ask you, what is an appropriate age to begin talking with children about race?
Yeah, so that's another great question. And I would say that, and I see there's a question in the chat that talks about this as well. And really, you can start with very young children. As Dr. Lewis already mentioned, the key thing is it being developed like a program. So the conversation you're going to have with a 5-year-old will be very different than you're going to have with a school-age child with an adult. Dr. Fillmore will talk more about. But for the littlest ones, I think what's important for us to recognize is they are quite aware of difference in the world. Part of the work of being little is to really gain knowledge and insight from the world around you. So young babies are extremely curious, as are toddlers and preschoolers, and they will recognize differences in skin color, hair color, wearing glasses, height, weight. All of those things are just data. What gives it valence is for them in the world in which they live, and they start to recognize that these differences have value. So we know that it's important for parents and educators to really begin that conversation very early, really to try and stop children being in color or gender, height or weight to some negative attitude or prevailing theory that exists. But you can start when they start having language with very sort of simple comments as you're looking at books with children, you're watching obviously appropriate programming with children. Again, those comments and those conversations can start to happen. And then as the child gets older, they're really build and become much more sophisticated.
Yeah, we're having a little bit of an audio issue there, so hopefully we can get that worked out. But I do want to just follow up quickly, Dr. Drage, and say, when you say very young, are we talking like 2-3 years old? How young?
Yeah, 2-3 years old.
Okay, so
yes,
toddler age.
Even. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. When toddlers begin experiencing their world, then that is a great time to talk to them about these kinds of issues, letting them know and understand that differences exist and that there is not necessarily a value attached to skin color, even though they may be seeing that in their broader world.
Yeah. Dr. Fellamore, in Sabrina M's piece on our WHYY website, you made the important distinction between race and racism when it comes to conversing with kids. Can you talk a little bit more about that?
Absolutely. So we, in kind of larger discourse, kind of emphasize the negative connotations and associations with race, discrimination, the school to prison pipeline, et cetera. I wanted to be sure that we pay attention to the ways that race is affirming, can be an important part of individuals' identities, especially young people, children of color, Black, Latinx, and Asian, and Native individuals. What the research shows us again and again is that a racial identity, being very secure in your sense of self as Black or Latinx, can buffer the effects of the negative effects of racism in schools and outside of schools as well. And so making that distinction and saying not race isn't a bad thing, and making that connection or separating the relationship between race and racism is key in helping individuals understand, or young children understand, that it can be a great thing to have a race. And I think we lost our host.
I was thinking too. So maybe talking, Dr. Fillmore, a little bit about your research in this area.
Yeah.
Might be helpful.
So I did my own research. Thank you, Dr. Joge. Looks at how race and racial identity is developed in immigrants. And so a lot of the immigrants who come to this country, particularly in the countries that I'm most interested in, Caribbean nations and African nations, this sense of race tends to be somewhat foreign. I mean, we understand that race exists, but the day-to-day lived experiences of having a race being categorized in the ways that we're categorized in the United States is something that people have to adjust to. And so for me, I look at schools and relationships with parents, own parents, and friends as places where adolescents, namely, and emerging adults, young adults, grapple with what it means to be Black, for example, for the populations that I'm most interested in, and making connections to other kind of realities from there. So.
Yeah. And so how do those conversations happen? I mean, what advice would you give to parents or educators who are listening, thinking about the ways in which, particularly for immigrants and for immigrants from the diaspora, how it might be very different when they come to the United States?
That's a big question. So I think, at least in the research that I do, most of the time, what I look at is how do I say this? Even immigrants oftentimes conflate race and racism, and the kind of negative realities with both. And so when those conversations happen, I talk about them as socializing conversations. This is in the kind of wealth of literature. Parents, unless they've had their own kind of strong sense of self in a racial way, can sometimes conflate the two, and might sometimes push their young people to kind of avoid identifying with the racial part of things, and culture that goes along with that. And so, but there can be some differences because these young people, the immigrant young people, are engaged. They're in schools where they're learning about race and racism and culture in these various ways. They have friends who might identify as Black, and that's not a bad thing, right? And so those kind of relationships can kind of interact and then push young people in directions that might look different from where their parents might be attempting to kind of model their behaviors or shape their behaviors.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I think that's I know that Dr. Lewis works with adolescents as well. Mm-hmm. Clearly, this is very different for me with the littlest ones, but I know, Dr. Lewis, you kind of sort of built on what Dr. Thelmore was saying from a more clinical perspective. Look.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think the issues that adolescents face these days are so significant, and we really have to make sure that we bring to light all these different struggles that they're experiencing on a day-to-day basis, and make sure that they understand that we're hearing them. I think that there's often a disconnect between adolescents and their older relatives, whether it be family members or other parents or other sort of family members, and really trying to sort of bridge that divide and give adolescents an opportunity to speak, because they have a lot to say, and they're thinking about a lot of different things, and we want to make sure that they have a voice and are able to sort of communicate all the things that they want to talk about. And now we lost Dr.
You lost Dr. One.
We have Tracy.
I think we have a question about the usefulness of the utility of having these conversations with young people, and the diversity of people in these groups. So mix of age and race and gender groups, or should we focus more on, I guess, what we call affinity groups, like having conversations within racial groups? What do you think, Dr. Lewis?
Sorry, I was just looking at, is the question somewhere on the?
It's on the chat, the public chat. But,
can you repeat it again? Or
I'll read the question. Yeah. Do you find it more beneficial to have these conversations with young people in mixed age, race, or gender groups, or in more singular groups?
I think that there are benefits to both. I think it's important that within sort of age and within racial sort of breakdowns, that children have opportunities to be able to talk about things with individuals that they see as similar. But I also see that I think there's value and benefit to being able to sort of cut across demographics and allow individuals to kind of talk about things, because the world is filled with lots of different people, and they're in environments, whether it be school or their community, where they are going to encounter lots of different people. So I think that there's benefits to both, and I think both should really happen.
Yeah, I think it also depends on who's guiding the conversations as well. Yes. With certain questions can be offered, and I'm thinking particularly with adolescents, certain questions can be offered to help push the discussion so we're getting a better understanding of those who have a racial identity that's not like our own, versus, and I think this is especially beneficial for white adolescents, because when we think about race, we can't forget them as well. To think about their own racial identity in ways that they often have not, largely because the world doesn't offer a lot of white young people to really explore what does it mean for me to be white. And so those kinds of same race groups particularly can be extremely helpful for exploring some of those questions.
Yeah, I agree.
Can you all hear me?
Yes.
Okay, great. Yay. Sorry to interrupt, but let me just say, wow, what an awesome panel. Thank you for carrying on in my absence. We're working on getting Dr. Jirage back as well. And thank you to our audience for being patient as we work through these technical difficulties. Unfortunately, I was not able to hear all of the conversation because there was some frantic activity going on here to get things back. Oh, there she is. All right, it looks like I think we have all of us back. All right. Well, let's do this. Thank you all for carrying on through all of this. I do have a few questions that I want to get to, and then I want to open it up because we have a number of questions from our audience as well. But Dr. Jirage, now that you're back, curious to know, should parents of color, and maybe if you've covered some of this in our absence, forgive me, but should parents of color have perhaps a different conversation with their children than white parents might have with their children?
Can you guys hear me?
Yes.
Okay, so
Yes.
I'm having a weird.
Yes.
I have a weird message saying that you can't, so I will just monitor
We
the
got
chat. Okay, so this is what I would say. I think that the most important thing is to have the conversation. Now, those conversations by necessity will be different, right? A white child's experience is different than a Black child's experience, different than a Latinx child's experience or an Asian child's experience. But when we're talking about the littlest ones, the ones under 5, all experiences are new and different. And so the main and the most important things for parents to help their child understand why they may be having a particular experience. And I think that really gets down to what we're talking about today and what we've been talking about, I guess, as a nation, is really making it very clear that differences do exist, but that there should not be these sort of negative values attached to these differences. And those values are learned, right? Little children learn from their environments. So the only way to sort of stop racism, to end racism, to really be anti-racist, is to teach these children from the youngest of ages that the differences exist and that there's beauty in those differences, right? That there is, the diversity of this nation is one of its strengths. And so the fact that children may have friends with different skin colors, different names, who speak different languages, those should be things that are celebrated. So I think the only difference in those conversations happens when a child has a negative experience, and then parents have to talk about why that experience happened, but to talk about race and I've been using skin color a lot because race is a social construct. And so for little children, they don't understand what race is that we're talking about today, but they do understand differences. And I think it really is important that parents are able to talk with them about the differences in skin color, just as they talk about everything else. I mean, I think what I find always very interesting is what Dr. Thelmore mentioned about this sort of stigma that's attached to these kinds of conversation. And I think Tracy mentioned it earlier as well. It makes these conversations so difficult when really children are learning everything from 0 to 5. And this is just another thing that they should be learning from their parents and from educators, from the experiences that they have.
Dr. Lewis, I want you to pick up on something that Dr. Jirage just spoke about, which is about, when a child of color does experience racism, whether it is overt as in name calling or it's more covert like exclusion from an event or something like that, what guidance can you give to parents to help them work through that?
Yeah. I first just wanted to touch base on the question before that about should the conversation be different for Black and brown youth versus white Caucasian youth, really from the perspective of adolescence. And I think that what I would say for that is that in some ways the conversation should be different, because the reality is, unfortunately, Black and brown youth and adolescents experience different things than white adolescents do here in America. But in some ways, the conversation should be the same, because I think that there should be acknowledgement, even among Caucasian families, of what Black and brown youth experience. I think similar to what Dr. Jaragi said in terms of younger children, the conversation may change because even within group, there are differences. So some African American and Black and brown and Latinx families have had different experiences. But I think acknowledging what sort of has happened, in recent months and over the years and throughout our country's history, I think is important. And when we're talking about adolescents, their sort of experience and understanding and exposure to these things is far greater. So I think it's important that they get acknowledged. And then in terms of the second question, the number one key thing is validating experience, letting our youth know that whatever they're feeling, whatever they're thinking, whatever they're experiencing is valid. It's really important as parents that we start with that sort of framework, that what you're experiencing right now, how you're feeling about that, those are legitimate thoughts, those are legitimate feelings. We're going to talk about them and help you with them, but this the key really is initially starting with this element of validation.
Well, and then there is the responsibility of the parent, who is probably feeling some anger around that themselves, to sort of handle their own anger in a way that is not irresponsible or that doesn't make the situation worse.
Yeah, absolutely. We can't take care of our children if we're not taking care of ourselves. So being able to have a place, a venue, a way to talk about and work through our own thoughts and feelings is really important. And so having, whether it be sort of a social support peer network of our own as adults, but being able to sort of manage that is really important. And then I think sort of demonstrating to our youth that we struggle with some of the same thoughts and feelings, that we struggle with anger and frustration, and helping them to see how we're able to sort of work through it and model for them that even though we're really angry, we talk about the anger and cope with this anger in appropriate ways or more healthy ways as compared to less healthy ways.
Yeah. Dr. Thellamore, I want to shift gears and ask you a little bit about social media, because our kids are all over social media. And while we as parents desire to protect them from, seeing maybe the George Floyd murder at a young age and deciding that maybe, that's not something they can handle. And yet it's all over the place on social media. And so I'm wondering what your thoughts are on how we can protect our children when that information is out there and help them to, navigate social media in a way that makes sense.
That is so hard, because again, with young kids seeing so much, social media makes it that we all see a lot, sometimes things that we don't want to. I think that should an adolescent come across, for example, George Floyd's dying on video, should the parent know about it? I think that's a rife area for checking in. I think Dr. Lewis's point about making sure that the feelings that we're feeling are validated and even more and addressed. The anger and the sadness and perhaps even the trauma of seeing that ought to be addressed. But then, I hate to say something like this is being used as an opportunity, but opening up the conversation about why and how this is allowed to happen. Or even having a meta conversation of the use of social media, how that's been used as a tool to shed light on these larger issues. Where social media can be, the conversations that happen tend to happen so quickly and in a lot of ways in an unfiltered way. I think it's a tremendous tool, particularly for other young people who are using social media. I know TikTok can be a bit controversial right now, but some of the videos that I've seen on TikTok, for example, are teenagers using what they're learning about racism and the pervasiveness of it, structural racism, and teaching other teenagers who are watching them about what this all means. And that's a phenomenal tool where sometimes the parents, I'm not to say parents are off the hook with this, but we know that a lot of peer conversations and peer relationships are very strong during this time. They're very useful during this time. And so having using social media to educate can be a big deal, especially if you're learning from someone your own age.
Yeah, it certainly adds a layer of complexity, but it also presents some opportunities, it sounds like.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. I want to shift. Did one of you want to weigh in before we? Okay. Want to ask about mixed race children, because that was certainly on the minds of many of our audience members who submitted questions in advance, and we will get to more specific audience questions in a moment. But just dealing with children who are of more than one race, how parents can talk to them about how to forge their positive identity, and how do parents approach that conversation. And I will open, well, let's say Dr. Jirage, I'd like you to take that one.
Okay. I was going to toss it to Dr. Lewis, but
We'll have him weigh in as well.
Okay. So I think that, and again, I always say this because I'm an infant preschool psychiatrist. And so the work that I do, both research and clinical, is with the littlest of people. And so I think that in that sense, it's a little bit easier than the work that Dr. Fellamore and Dr. Lewis are doing, because they're doing with adolescents who, have a whole wider range of thoughts and views. But for families who are having different experiences as they navigate the world, and then they're trying to talk about that with their very young child, it's an easier conversation, right? Because the young child is already going to be curious when they look at their parents and see the differences in their parents. And this also could be for parents who are of the same race, but just have very different complexions. So those questions are still, or families, right, that are sort of just these very diverse families, where again, the family unit itself might be of the same race, but the larger family is very diverse. And so just saying that, right, that mommy's skin is brown, super brown, and daddy's skin is a little bit paler, and your skin is kind of in between. And then again, having those conversations when they're normative, they're a typical part of development, and there's nothing more than that. These are the differences that we see. And then as children get older and they start recognizing that there are sort of different values attached to skin and the different hues, then it's talking a little bit about how that might look for that family, right? When the family's out together in public. Actually, I had a friend who is in a multiracial couple. She's African-American and her husband is Caucasian. And when one of their littlest ones was born, she was very fair, very, very fair. And my friend at the time was living in Brooklyn. And she took her baby out to the grocery store to, do whatever. And someone commented to her what a great job she was doing with that baby, and if she had any openings for, being a nanny to their child. And so again, at that time, that baby was probably like 18 months. And so didn't necessarily understand the tenor of that conversation, but she did understand when her mother became very upset. But if that child had been 3 or 5, they really would have understood that this person did not understand that this was her mother. And that, again, would lead to a conversation that the child who knows nothing but this mother would have to then have with her parents about why that happened in the grocery store, why that happened on the plane or on the sidewalk. And so I think that, sometimes it's these exterior moments that lead to conversations. And then that is the time when you say, so we've been telling you about the differences in our skin color in this family, but not everyone has that same kind of family. And some people think, and then sort of insert the blank, right? That some people think that darker skin means that you can only, be someone's nanny or au pair, and that, darker skin might have this other sort of negative attribute. So again, I think that these opportunities, unfortunately, present themselves just in the act of living. But within one's household, you can very much control that conversation with the littlest of ones.
Dr. Lewis, you work with adolescents, with older children. What do you say?
So, I guess the first thing I would say is that although identity development, whether you're talking about, racial identity, gender identity, sexual identity, no matter what, although it's the sort of developmental milestone of adolescence, it's so complicated that it's something well into adulthood many of us are struggling with. So I think it's important, with our adolescents that we sort of help them to know that they don't have to have all the answers right now at 15, 16, 17, 18, because that's just not possible. Sort of let them know that that this is a process that they're beginning now to figuring out who they are and how they relate to the people around them and the people on the, in larger communities around them, but that it's a process that's going to be ongoing. I agree with Dr. Draghi that having very explicit conversations about, what you look like versus what mom looks like versus dad or mom and mom or whoever's in the household, having explicit conversations and how has that been experienced? What have you experienced in your day-to-day, life? And also the idea that everybody, how they may conceptualize themselves might be different from how you might conceptualize them as their parent, how you think they might conceptualize themselves. I've worked with adolescents and parents. The parent thought that, a mixed race child, the parent thought that they sort of considered themselves African-American and they considered themselves Caucasian, or they considered themselves both black and white. So not making assumptions because everybody's different. But having those conversations are really important.
Yeah. What about adoptive families where, you might have, and I think Dr. Jiragi alluded to this a little bit, but, you've got mixed races right within the family. And she also talked about, extended family, perhaps, of different races and helping children to navigate all of that and sort of where they fit into that and how they should be thinking about that. And that's for you, Dr. Lewis.
Okay. Yeah. So, that's sort of another example of a situation where you might have a child and sort of they look different from one or both of their caregivers. And so, again, having explicit conversations about skin color, about race, about what you look like versus what I look like, about what other people may see when they look at you, because children understand that, they see that, they walk around knowing and sort of seeing this, and so putting it into a conversation is really important.
Yeah. We've got Dr. Thellamore, go ahead.
I was just going to add to that. I think particularly if the parents come from a place, for adoptive parents especially, if they come from a place of racial privilege, and either white parents, and they might not have the answers for some of the questions that, especially if it's a transracial adoption, some of the questions that their children might have. And so community in those cases can be incredibly important. Finding resources, so many books have been shared over the last few weeks about race and racism, identity, and all of that. So finding the resources, and especially the people who can help speak to these issues in ways that a parent might not be very intimate with. So I just wanted to add that piece as well.
Yeah. Well, speaking of resources, before we get to our audience questions, what can you recommend for parents, teachers, significant adults in a child's life to educate themselves if need be, and also to help children navigate these issues? Maybe books, films, what would you recommend? Dr. Thellamore.
I know I'm thinking what are my favorite books? as I'm thinking about book titles, and there are so many, I'm like going through the catalog. I would say first, if possible, tap into networks, if not social networks. If you're not in a place where you can find people like you immediately, social networks. And if you are in a place where there are groups of people who meet to discuss these issues, those networks as well. There's so many books about the how racism plays out in this country that break down what structural racism is. So many ones that have been suggested. How to be less, forget the title, but How to Be Less Stupid About Race is one. So You Want to Talk About Race is another. There's so many that are really written for the public and kind of like non-academic jargon that can be very helpful. And then I will add as a third, for young children, books are incredibly important as resources to offer those conversations. I think Dr. Jirage said it very clearly that it's really helpful. Like children are very concrete. What they see is kind of what they understand. And so books as opening up the conversation, reading children's books about history and race, kind of breaking down some like cultural issues in a very easy to digest way can be incredible for both parents and their children as they're continuing to learn. So those are my
Dr. Jirage, anything you'd like to add to that? Any resources that you would recommend?
Yeah, so I mean, I definitely agree with Dr. Thellamore. I mean, we know how enriching books are for very young children. A couple of places where I've been sending families and folks, Sesame Workshop has done really a lot of work. And there's a clip of Abby Kadabi talking about prejudice and empathy. And that's a nice thing for the preschool set. For older kids, the National Museum of African American History and Culture has this wonderful website where you can really sort of tool around on it and find things for both adolescents and then again for adults. And then for all ages, there are all kinds of age by age guides to teach anti-racism. Common Sense Media is a site that I send a lot of families. It's not just for movies or television programs, but they also have books on there. And then the nice thing about that site is that they'll have for the age of the child, and they'll tell you like a little synopsis of those books. And again, they have a sort of race and racism, sort of thing that you can click on. And Embrace Race is another really nice resource too, where you can go and really find all kinds of information that, like Dr. Thellamore was saying, is really, it's digestible for everyone. And I think that, you CHOP as well. We actually have on our website, we have a link to some resources for, again, all ages for young children, for sure that school age children, adolescents, and for parents. So I think that now is a time that people are really curating these lists and these resources and making it as easy as possible for parents. And if you don't have access to a computer or broadband, calling your local library is another really wonderful way. And your local librarian who can do some of that footwork for you and then order those books and send them to you. So there are, I think, a number of ways in which families can really gain some more information and maybe even some more confidence in having these conversations with their children and within their families.
Great. Dr. Lewis, anything you'd like to add to that?
The only thing I was going to add is that I think it's really important that we expose our children, whether it be we're talking about white children or Black or brown children, to arts and literature of multicultural, authors who are white, authors who are Latinx, who are African American, Native American, print media, that we just expose our children to the multicultural world that's out there.
Yeah, great advice. Well, let's go to some questions from our audience. There's one here from John that says, could you perhaps together demonstrate a typical good beginning conversation? So I will leave that to you panelists, but what would be a good beginning conversation? And obviously that will vary depending on how old the child is. Maybe Dr. Jirage, you could start with the littlest ones.
So I think so there are a couple of good ways to do this if you have little ones under the age of 5. So one of them could be as you're reading books, and as Dr. Lewis and Dr. Thellamore stated, getting books with diverse characters is really a very easy way to begin to talk about these as you're doing bedtime stories, or as you're going for nap time, and as you're looking at the pictures in the book, even before the child is able to read and has a lot of language, you can talk about the differences in the children. And that's a very sort of simple and I think elegant way to begin to talk about differences. Another thing you could do is through your child's peers, right? Through their playmates, through if they're in care outside of the home and that care is diverse, then sort of through those experiences by talking about the differences in their friends' skin colors, or maybe the foods that they eat, or the languages that they speak. And again, really just making it part and parcel of educating your very young child. And the last thing that you can do with little ones that is sort of organic and makes sense developmentally is if you're watching developmentally appropriate, pro-social, preschool age programming. Again, I say Sesame Street because, I'm a fan.
Aren't we all?
Right? And they have always had diverse people living on Sesame Street. So again, that's another nice way that children are learning their ABCs, as well as learning about race and anti-racism in a way that makes sense for the preschool age child.
Yeah. Dr. Thellamore, what about for older children? What might be a good way to kick off that conversation?
I would tack on books can be really great too, but now we're getting into perhaps more, maybe not quite young adult, but more teenage friendly type books that would start opening up the conversation. So I know The Hate You Give was a very popular one, for example. So like a book club between parents and children might be a start. And here too, maybe slightly curated by the parents to start watching the news together and kind of thinking about, well, what's going on in these news stories that you're noticing? Have you ever heard about some of these issues? And using the news as a conversation starter for young people. And then third, I love Dr. Jarage's kind of point about helping to continue to diversify those peer groups. We know that particularly as we navigate school, many young children are kind of in their own racial silos. And so to the extent possible, first having their child think about why might that be, and then, consider how to help to kind of expand their exposure to people who are not like them.
Another question from our audience: how would you suggest, and forgive me if I'm asking something that you may have covered during our technical difficulties, but how would you suggest talking to white children about white privilege, if at all? So I'll let any one of you jump in on that who might want to tackle that.
So even though this is not necessarily a conversation that you have with preschoolers, I think it is important, right? I think that what we've seen in this national conversation that we've been having is this, sort of awareness that has always existed, but maybe has not been spoken at the volume that it is now, right? So many families of color have clearly been having these conversations, but clearly not all families have been having these conversations. And I think that to understand the United States, you have to understand the history. And as Dr. Thellamore mentioned, structural racism is a part of that history. And so I think when you look at the historical background, I think it's an easier conversation to have, because you can look and see sort of how these systems were built, how they led to these sort of gains by white people, how they led to sort of very clear losses. When you're looking at sort of redlining, or the ways in which schools' budgets are created, or where there are sort of hospitals and other places where health is taken care of, grocery stores, green spaces. All of these things really look historically and can very clearly pinpoint when these differences happen, right? When communities were built, how they were built, who was able to have access. And then that will just by default lead into a conversation about privilege and what is privilege and how that happens and what that looks like.
Question, and this was submitted in advance from our audience. Dr. Thellamore, I'll ask you about this one. How do I talk to my 10-year-old grandson about race when his parents are unfortunately racists?
Oh, um, um, when I have had this conversation with my students, I would start kind of with understanding that these are your parents. Because I think there's sometimes a bit of a disconnect for young people, children, who are like, my parents are, you know, they're my parents and I love them, but also they have these attitudes and beliefs about people. To kind of start off with the kind of validating, this is my relationship, these are your parents, right? And they love you. However, people can have beliefs that aren't good, for lack of a better term in the moment, that don't paint people in a very good light. I think that, as with anything, it should be an ongoing conversation, where maybe perhaps outside of kind of thinking about the parent-child relationship, pointing to ways, as a child is bringing up these kind of topics that their parents might have brought up, offering counter narratives. So if parents are saying all Latinx people are this or that, offering counter narratives where Latinx people are doing the exact opposite and in mass numbers, right? And so we're starting to combat now with evidence why these particular ideas might be problematic. It's a great question.
Well, and with school getting ready to start, we've got a few questions that it sounds like come from teachers. One is, please address how white staff can address this issue of working with predominantly minority students. There is another question about how to address all of this in a Zoom kind of format, because so much of school has been online, and maybe as schools reopen in one form or another in the next month or two. So we would love to hear your thoughts about that. And again, Dr. Thellamore, as an educator, what would you say about that for white staff members, and also for any staff members who are having to maybe do this online in a sort of different environment than being face-to-face in a classroom?
Yeah, my first bit of advice would be to kind of take a look at your curriculum. There are places where, outside of kind of the Black History Month or Latin American History Month model that we have, where we just kind of highlight issues in one segment, there are places throughout the curriculum that we can start promoting kind of an anti-racist view of things, revisiting how history is taught, revisiting what literature is read, right? To continue to have these conversations be an ongoing thing, is my kind of first suggestion. In a Zoom format, it's difficult. It truly is difficult. But to the extent to which, and again, this might vary according to grade, I'm thinking largely high school, the extent to which students can have a chance to unpack some of these things, both together and with the teacher, is incredibly important. I know Zoom has all of these capabilities. Even myself, as I'm thinking about my course on these topics in the fall, I'm going to play with how to have these conversations, to break out and have young people talk to each other, to think about the ways that this might look different. These topics of structural racism, the history of racism in this country, might look different from what they've been exposed to in school to this point, right? But this can only happen if the curriculum is revisited, that educators spend time really digging into the ways that race is either glossed over or ignored, or in worst cases, negative stereotypes about people of color are perpetuated.
Dr. Lewis, how do we balance teaching that the police are here to help, and for some, the police have been or are hurtful? How do we balance instilling confidence in the systems around us while also instilling critical thinking about how different communities have and continue to experience injustice from these institutions?
Yeah, I mean, so, as I was saying before, in terms of the reality is that Black and brown youth and families have had different experiences than white and Caucasian families. Many adolescents that I talked with, I'm getting an echo all of a sudden. Many adolescents that I talked with have communicated to me very difficult.
Yeah, I'm wondering if it's possible that that's the earbuds and the mic there. I don't know, but I'm going to ask you to hold that thought.
Sure.
I'm hearing echo too. Dr. Thellamore, let's see if we can get you to tackle that a little bit while we see if we can get the audio straightened out.
Do I have an echo? Ooh, I do.
Oh, yeah. I'm hearing a little bit there as well. Well, let's try it and see what happens.
I think this can be a place for some, as you mentioned, some critical thinking. There are a lot of perspectives on these institutions, as I'm reading maybe the police, and how to whether there is hope for maintaining trust in these institutions. For young people, I think having structuring, particularly as I'm thinking about school, especially structuring these discussions where multiple viewpoints are offered fairly, and giving students a chance to kind of think through those perspectives can be extremely useful. And perhaps it might come to the conclusion that maybe, as these institutions exist, there isn't, maybe we need to remodel how they function in our society. And that's an option. That's an option.
Yeah, thank you. We are definitely having some echo issues, and someone suggested that perhaps we try muting everyone except for the speaker at the moment, so we can give that a try. I just have to thank our audience, because you all have been so encouraging through all of this with our technical difficulties and offering so much great information. Just want to mention, and Emma, I don't hear an echo right now. Do you all hear an echo?
That seems better.
Okay. All right. We might be on our way to figuring this out, but we've just in the midst, we've gotten some great tips. Sarah says, the Equal Justice Initiative has a daily online calendar that tells untold stories of racial injustice, which I actually happen to have on the wall behind me. It's been a powerful resource, she says, for me, and would work for adolescents and to share intergenerationally. I absolutely can agree with that, because I look at that all the time, and it's got some great stories. So I just want to take a moment and thank our audience for all the tips, technical and otherwise, that have helped us to navigate all of this. I want to ask Dr. Lewis again. There's a question about race being a social construct, and how, in simple language, might we be able to explain that? And this is probably more of an adolescent question, but how do we explain sort of the idea that race is really a social construct?
Yeah, I think that, the way that conversation can happen with an adolescent is by just pointing out sort of all the examples of how that comes about. Pointing out sort of the way that happens, the way that sort of race gets sort of decided and thought about and figured into people's sort of viewpoints. So I think that the main thing is really just giving concrete examples of the situation. As I said before, our kids, particularly our adolescents, are sort of far more aware of these issues than we give them credit for. And I think just having the conversation and opening up can be a great starting point and really sort of lead to a fruitful conversation.
Another question for you, Dr. Lewis. How do you suggest handling a situation where the child is not yours, where you need to make sure you are not stepping on the toes of parents? So I'm guessing that this is in talking about race. Should it come up, your child's friend is at the house, or whatever the situation might be, and what are maybe some guidelines for someone who is not the parent, but maybe wants to constructively engage?
Yeah, I think that I think it's important that we sort of feel empowered to be able to impart our messages to the world around us. Doing so, as long as you're doing so in a respectful way, and sort of presenting your viewpoint in a respectful way, then that's I think that's an important piece of parenting, an important piece of being an adult in this community. People can have different opinions. People can have different viewpoints. But I think, I think it's important that we communicate to everybody how we feel about situations. Going back to the question earlier about, sort of having a conversation. You can use what's going on in the world around us. The reality is that there are protests happening, and there's reason why people are protesting. And so you can have a conversation that there are people who feel, that are angry about X or feel strongly about Y. And if you yourself believe similarly, you can sort of tie yourself into it, just as we believe that this is happening and we think it should be different. That's why those people are protesting. But if you feel different than that, you should still bring it up, that people feel this way. They believe that there is racial injustice, that there are, real problems in the way that policing is happening in our community, and that's why they are voicing their displeasure. So I think everybody should be sort of using what's going on in the world around us to have these conversations.
Speaking of protests, Dr. Jurage, what is your advice to parents who may want to take their children to a protest? What do they need to keep in mind before they go?
So I think there are a couple of things. I mean, first of all, they need to know their child and recognize whether or not their child is someone who will be like invigorated or excited by this sort of community exercising their voice in a democracy, or if their child will get freaked out by the situation. And if they're in the former group, then it's remembering to physically distance, to wear masks, to take Purell, and then to figure out if they want to make a sign or how that child would like to participate in this democracy. I mean, I was talking the other day with a colleague at CHOP about the importance of voting and how to get very young children interested in voting. And, I was telling her that one of the ways for children to recognize their ability to participate in our democracy before the age of 18 is through these various forms of having their voices heard, whether that's through what Dr. Othellamar said earlier, TikTok or Instagram or Facebook, where they're forming groups together and discussing these issues of race, racism, and anti-racism, whether that's participating safely, physically distancing, masking in these protests with their fellow citizens, whether that's writing letters to their Congress people, whether that's, going out there and talking and organizing themselves, that these are all opportunities for children to participate in a world in which they live and the world that they will inherit.
Yeah. Before we go, I would like to ask for each of you to answer this question in, let's say, 30 seconds or less. And that is that we are living in a fraught time. We are all under, I think, extraordinary stress, right? We are dealing with the racial reckoning that's happening in the country. We're in the middle of a global pandemic that doesn't seem to show any signs of letting up anytime soon. We've seen massive job losses. The economy is tanking. There are so many reasons for all of us to feel stress. And this racial question is, at the top of that list for many of us. And so just wondering what advice each of you would have for us, just in terms of coping strategies. How do we get through the rest of 2020? How do we sort of keep all of this in balance and sort of, keep our heads up and help our families to kind of make it through what has become a very challenging year? I'll start with Dr. Lewis, and we'll work our way around Dr. Thellamore, and then Dr. Jurage, you get the last word. Dr. Lewis? Can you hear me?
And sorry, I was muted to try to help with the and then I had to unmute myself.
Okay.
So I would say my number one piece of advice would be to use the social support that you have. We have a lot of people in our lives, friends and family, that can really help us out to be able to cope during this really difficult time that, with everything going on right now, as you said, 2020, there's so many stressors at play right now that it's really important that we use the people around us as support in all the ways that support happens, whether it be as a distraction, venting, problem solving, physical support, whatever type of support that you need. Please, use that network to help get you through these really challenging times.
Great. Dr. Thellamore? Can you hear me?
Yeah, I can. I was unmuting myself too. I would say this has been working for me for the last few weeks. Log off and do something for you. There's a lot of information coming at us at all times. And I'm a very active social media Twitter user. And every day feels like worse than the day before. And so I'm learning that for myself. I'm limiting my time, and then I just log off and I go find something for myself, take a walk, watch something on TV that's kind of brainless, just to kind of get out of this. It can be a lot to take in at all times. And so to kind of lift the cognitive load of it all, just disconnect for a little bit. It can be incredibly useful.
Great sanity saver. Dr. Jirage, you get the last word.
Yeah, so I mean, clearly I agree with both of my colleagues. I mean, I'm an optimist by nature. The patients that I see are under the age of 5, so I can't help but be optimistic. But that being said, it's hard, right? I think we should just acknowledge that it's hard, and also acknowledge that we will see our way through it. I mean, that's the only other way we can look at this. Again, people are scared, people are upset, and we need to understand that all of these challenges exist, and in varying ways for all of us. I think I agree with Dr. Thellamore. I have become really enamored with Netflix, and I think as well with Dr. Lewis, having support systems, friends and family. I have family all over the world. And so checking in and making sure everyone's doing okay has been important for me, as well as imagining a day in the future when we aren't where we are now.
Yeah. Well, we cannot thank all of you enough. Let me see if I can. Yeah, we're still getting a little echo here. Dr. Jason Lewis, Dr. Barbara Thellamore, Dr. Wanjiku Jirage, and also to Christine Holbert from WHYY, who has been working tirelessly behind the scenes to bring this conversation to all of you. And thanks to all of you who have joined us from all over the area for this incredibly important conversation. We so appreciate it. We hope that you will take the advice that's been offered here from our panelists. And also, this conversation will be accessible. If you look in the chat there's some information on how to access it later if you'd like to go back and reference it again. Again, I'm Tracy Matisak. Thank you all so much. Enjoy the rest of your day and stay healthy. Bye-bye.